years from now, would you be willing to trade all the days from this day to that for one chance, just one chance, to come back here and tell our enemies that they may take our lives, but they'll never take our freedom?
Anti-Tyranny News Radio here on UCY.tv. Thank you for joining me this evening. Quite a bit of financial, economic news, and also some foreign news that I do want to get into later here. Probably do that sometime in the second hour. But I kind of want to get more into the economic side. To start off with, we hear the stock market's getting better, unemployment numbers are getting better. Remember, we heard this under Obama. We understand that it's not getting worse, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's getting better. We have a point where we have more people making more money out of the population, but at the same time, you get the same things that people were purchasing with cash in previous generations. You now get a loan that takes you 30 years, which is, a lot of times. There's a lot of people that get stuck refinancing, rolling it over, having to take money out, and really, they might own the house the time they die, hopefully. But it's one of those deals that just because there's more people making more money doesn't necessarily mean it brings them above the poverty line. One article I have here out of the economiccollapseblog.com, the middle class is being destroyed. Now only 25% of all Americans have $10,000 or more in savings. Only a quarter of Americans. $10,000 is not exactly a lot of money, but it is at the same time. For people, that 10,000 is just as valuable as it was 15 years ago. $10,000 is quite a bit of money. But in reality, when you look at prices, inflation, true inflation, you really look at 10,000 as well. That would definitely knock off some of a bill if you have that house or that car loan. Maybe a couple semesters of college for your kids. depending on what topic you go to. Maybe a portion of the first semester. I'll read part of this article, and then I got a clip I want to play. I did want to cover some of this. It says we just got more evidence that the middle class is being systematically eviscerated. According to a geo banking rate survey that was just released, more than half of the country has less than $1,000 in savings. So, in the event of a major economic disaster of some kind, over 50% of the nation is going to be completely out of cash almost immediately. For years, I've been writing about the steady decline of the middle class in the United States, but I still get astounded by numbers such as these. According to this new survey, only 25% of all Americans have $10,000 or more in savings at this point. $0 saved, 39%. Less than $1,000 saved, 18%. 1,000 to 4,999, 12%. 5,000 to 9,999, 6%. 10,000 or more, 25%. Other surveys have come up with similar results. One discovered that about 2/3 of the country is living paycheck to paycheck, and another was conducted by the Federal Reserve found that 44% of U.S. adults do not even have enough money to cover an unexpected $400 expense. Most of us have grown accustomed to barely scraping by from month to month, but that is not what being middle class is supposed to be about. If you are in the middle class, you should be making more than you are spending and building long-term wealth. But just like our federal government, most of us are spending money like there is no tomorrow. We don't have quite enough money for what we want to do. We just borrow more. Right now, U.S. consumers are more than $12 trillion in debt, and it's impossible to build any real wealth when you are constantly drowning in red ink. And again, you can read the rest of that article at the economiccollapseblog.com. I want to add something to that. You know, we see that, okay, there might be more people making a little bit more money. But things that we purchase, if you're not well off, extremely well off, when you go buy furniture, when you go buy, a home, you are not getting what you're paying for in actuality, because you're getting cheaper built things that don't retain value, that don't gain value. Now, when it comes to a house, okay, your property, well, everybody's in an addition now. Well, let me tell you about cheap housing additions. Ones that they look like they're, a bigger home, but you can just tell they're cheap. They don't look like they're built real great. Well, that's because they're not. Those type of additions tend to start turning into pretty slummy areas faster than, some of these real old homes, inner city areas that have slowly fallen apart. But again, those houses were also built in, the 1900s, where now you have homes that they're 15, 20 years old now, 25 years old, and they look about the same condition as those ones that were built in 1915, 1920. 1930. I have a buddy that has an old house, and the strength of that house is just unbelievable. It's not a big house, but when you look at how they built it like they were building a gigantic house. You know, everything is heavy duty. It's meant to last. You don't have that anymore. So when you have what supposed to be considered middle class, but really they're still living paycheck to paycheck, so they're not technically middle class, except we call them that now. They're living paycheck to paycheck and can't afford to buy anything that withstands time, that holds on to value to a certain extent. Where, you know, you look online and you see that 20-year-old couch, but because it was this imported and handmade from who the hell knows where, you know, couch that can seat 3 people. Well, you know, it's only 15 grand. But look at the leather. Well, it's kind of cracked. Well, yeah, but this is a special type of leather, and oh, what the hell ever. Because it is handcrafted. It's not cheap made. That leather might, you know, be a fine leather or something that's harder to get. I don't know, but you notice that certain things will hold value and certain things won't. And we know why. We bought stuff at Walmart. We bought stuff at box stores. We bought I bought a brand new vacuum. I'm thinking, you know, I'm spending $150 on a vacuum. I'm thinking it's got to be halfway decent. Yeah, it broke within, I think, 4 months, 5 months. And it's just like they just don't make things, you know. And I know people that have vacuums that are old, still take the bag. Things are like 30 years old, 40 years old, still work. You pay a price for them keeping that so-called inflation down. They're not making inflation down. They're just making cheaper products and putting them out there to make you feel like it's down. But things that they still make heavy duty built stuff. They still make really good things like they did in the past. Except now the price of those things have actually gone up. They just replaced them with cheaper things. Okay, see how it's going? To add on to all of that, we have another issue with this out of control government. We are now 20, or actually over, $20 trillion in debt. And I'm going to get into this clip. I'm not going to play the whole thing, but this is Peter Schiff and Stefan Molyneux talking about the new acquiring of debt. And I'll kind of get into, you know, Trump and the whole, you know, collusion, whatever you want to call it, behind this. So let's go ahead and get into this clip first.
Stefan Molyneux from Freedom Radio, back with a good friend, Peter Schiff, an economist, financial broker, dealer, author, frequent guest on national news, the host of the most excellent Peter Schiff Show podcast, the CEO of Euro Pacific Capital, and the chairman of Schiff Gold. You can check him out at Schiff Gold. That's SCHIFF Gold. SchiffRadio.com and Europac.com. Thanks, Peter, for taking the time today.
Well, my pleasure.
So, shock of all shocks, they seem to keep raising the debt ceiling. Now, this is a pretty abstract term for a lot of people. I wonder if you could give us a brief history of how it started, what it's designed to accomplish, and why it just seems like a kid trying to reach for a helium balloon that's constantly out of reach.
Yeah, well, first of all, you know, they didn't actually raise it. They extended the suspension. See, the last time, they didn't even raise the ceiling. People are too embarrassed to vote to raise it. now sometime in December. And so during the time that they suspended it, of course, all of a sudden the debt shot up, and now we're almost at 20.2 trillion because apparently there was a bunch of debt that they weren't even showing officially because technically they weren't allowed to have it. So it's like they cooked the books for a while, and then all of a sudden it shows up, right? But now they're talking about eliminating the ceiling. Donald Trump said he's got some kind of gentleman's agreement going on with the Democrats that, hey, let's just get rid of this debt ceiling so that we never have to deal with the fact that maybe it won't be lifted. Because the politicians have succeeded in making irresponsibility look responsible. Because every time there's a threat not to raise the debt ceiling, they label the people who don't want to raise it as you're reckless, you're irresponsible, you have to raise it. I mean, America always pays its bills. You can't monkey around with our faith and credit. The irony of it is we never pay our bills. That's why we have all this debt. If we were paying our bills, we wouldn't have to raise the debt ceiling because our bills would be paid. We have to raise the debt ceiling so we can continue to not pay our bills. So we can take on debt instead of paying our bills. And the whole idea that we're going to default, if we can't borrow more money, we're going to default, is an admission that the whole thing is a Ponzi scheme. It's like we need to raise the debt ceiling so we can keep the Ponzi scheme going, so we can borrow more money that we can never repay to pay off the people who have already loaned us money. But if you want to go back to why we even have a debt ceiling, why did Congress pass one? You got to go back about 100 years. That's how long it's been here. So the Federal Reserve was created by an act of Congress in 1913. So prior to the Federal Reserve, there was no central bank. And all the currency was issued privately by banks. And it was all backed by gold. Right? That was the money we had. Now, when the Federal Reserve came around, the Federal Reserve was created to be a national bank. And it was also going to issue a currency that was backed by gold. But it was going to be backed by other paper, other debts of other banks, commercial paper. And so, but the original Federal Reserve Act prohibited the Federal Reserve from buying or owning any obligations of the U.S. government. So they couldn't buy treasuries. And that was by design because they didn't want the government to be able to borrow from the central bank. They didn't want the central bank to work in concert with the government to make it easier for the government to go into debt. And so, and that was, if they didn't do that, they never would have passed the Federal Reserve Act. Nobody would have voted for it if it could lend money to the government. But, there's an old saying about the camel and the nose and the tent, right? And so a few years after they created the Federal Reserve Act, the government got us into World War I, which was a giant mistake, which I don't even want to get into, because had we never even got into World War I, there would have been no World War II. There would have been no Adolf Hitler. But not that I'm saying it's our fault, but it was a big mistake to go into World War I. But the government did it, and then they quickly used the war to take advantage of the public to grab power that they couldn't do. And so we got things like the estate tax and the gift tax that have never gone away, which is why I say we lost every war, because every time there's a war, we get new taxes. And then when the war is over, the taxes are permanent. But one of the things that happened is that even though taxes went up during the First World War, and they did, remember, because the income tax came in 1913 also, and the top rate was, I think, 6%. And during the First World War, they jacked it up to like 50%. So that was, they really went up there. But they needed even more money. So they amended the Federal Reserve Act because we were at war. And they amended it to say that the Federal Reserve could buy treasuries. That way, the Federal Reserve could help finance the First World War. But in order to do that, because there were many congressmen that didn't want to vote for that, because they were like, wait a minute, if we do this, we have really opened up a floodgate. We've opened up a Pandora's box. We have now allowed the government to borrow from its own central bank. We want to have a limited government. We want small government. This potentially can make government much bigger. So what they did is they said, okay, we will let the government borrow from the Federal Reserve, but we're going to limit how much the government can borrow with a debt ceiling. So they passed the debt ceiling back then to make sure that the government didn't abuse the privilege that it was just given, that it could borrow to help finance this war, but we're going to put a ceiling so that we don't have too much debt. Well, the mistake that they made was that having a ceiling that could be raised, because obviously the initial debt ceiling wasn't 20 trillion. I'm not even sure what it was. I mean, it was probably a couple of billion at most. But and so they've raised it every time we've gotten near it. So it really, it hasn't been a ceiling. But you have to believe that it has been some type of break. That had we had no ceiling at all, the debts would be much higher. That is why it's so scary now. They want to get rid of it. If we have $20 trillion in debt, despite the ceiling, imagine how much more debt we're going to have if we get rid of the ceiling altogether, right? And we don't even have a pretense of the ceiling, and we can just spend whatever we want, borrow, until we have a complete catastrophe.
But sorry, but that, I don't see how that would happen, Peter, because if they say we are not going to have a debt ceiling anymore, they're signaling to all of their lenders that they functionally have no interest. They're never going to repay anything. Now, isn't that going to dry up lenders, and isn't that going to drop the value of the U.S. dollar? I'm going to substitute some Chinese gold-backed currency for the international reserve currency. I mean, isn't that a clear signal that, you have no interest whatsoever in paying anything? How are they going to get lenders outside of the Fed after that?
Well, I mean, eventually, yes. I mean, they can read the writing on the wall. I mean, while we have a debt ceiling, we can pretend that there's some limit and there's some type of fiscal responsibility. In fact, when I ran for U.S. Senate, my whole campaign, one of my stump speeches was send me to the Senate and I will do my best to make sure the debt ceiling is not raised. Because, a lot of people campaigned on a balanced budget amendment. In fact, almost every Republican who runs for office says, I want a balanced budget. Well, they do that because they know it's never going to happen. It's never even going to come up for a vote. But what Republicans could do if they wanted to, if they were actually serious, and of course, most of them are not, I would have been, if they simply refused to raise the debt ceiling, the budget has to balance that year. That's it. The party's over. So that's something that's doable. That's what I wanted to do. But if they get rid of the only tool that could possibly rein in the profligacy, then the sky's the limit on borrowing. And then if we're not going to have our own ceiling, then it's going to be up to our creditors, the lenders, to impose a ceiling. Because, we can borrow as much as we want so long as there's somebody that's willing to lend, right? It takes two to tango. We can't dance by ourselves. We need a partner. And if our partners say, wait a minute, now you owe us $20 trillion or whatever it is, and now you just took away the debt ceiling, and we don't want to loan you anymore, at least not at these really low interest rates. So we'll loan you some money, but give me 5%, give me 10%. But we obviously can't afford to pay that. We can barely afford to pay 1%. So if that's the case, we only have one dance partner, and that's the Fed. But that dance is going to rain money, right? And then we destroy the dollar. And then it's just, Katie bar the door, everybody's going to be going. And then it's a monetary crisis. It's going to make, Hurricane Irma look like a sun shower. This is going to be, more than Category 5 financial storm, much bigger than 2008.
Well, isn't there some evidence that lack of trust of the U.S. dollar is already happening? I mean, the dollar is down, dollar index is down 12% recently, which is, as you pointed out, the worst year for the dollar since 1985. And that dollar depression lasted quite a long time. So isn't there some evidence that people are waking up to the fact that the U.S. has kind of given up on paying back its bills?
I mean, a little bit. But, I think more and more is going to become evident. That dollar bear market lasted 10 years, from 85 to 95. And then, the dot-com bubble kind of inflated and then bought the dollar a new lease on life. And then when that bubble popped, we had another 6-year dollar bear market. Dollar went to a record low. Ironically, the financial crisis saved at that time. But this time, I don't think there's going to be no saving by the bell. I think this time the dollar is going to be the crisis, and it's going to fall until it collapses. And yes, more people are going to wake up to this reality. One of the reasons the dollar rallied for a few years is because people were deluded into believing that the Fed actually solved our problem. They believed Ben Bernanke and all the other central bankers who were congratulating themselves for putting out the fire that they lit. But the problem is they put it out with gasoline, so it's coming back. It's not really out. But people thought everything was great. We're going to normalize interest rates. We're going to shrink our balance sheet. Job well done. And the dollar was rising based on all this false optimism. Well, people are going to find out that the Federal Reserve made all the problems worse, that they're never going to come close to normalizing interest rates. In fact, they're only back at 1% now, despite the 4 or 5 rate hikes. We're at 1%. The Fed hasn't shrunk its balance sheet by 1 nickel, despite all the talk. Meanwhile, we're about to go back into a recession. It's long overdue. And then what? The Fed's going to cut rates again, but they're starting from 1. they're going to do another round of QE, but they're starting with a $4.5 trillion balance sheet. And when the markets wake up to this reality and they realize that I was right from the beginning, that they checked us into a monetary roach motel, that there is no way out, that there is no end game, that it's QE forever, that it's zero or negative rates, the bottom is going to drop out of the dollar. And people have better be protected. I mean, that's why I've got my clients, I've got their money invested around the world. I've got stocks in currencies in countries that are, relatively sound. That's why I've been buying gold for people. A lot of people, think, they see the problem. They've got the wrong solution. They bought all these cryptocurrencies, and I know they've gone up, so people think they're smart, but they just don't realize that other people are even more foolish than they were and who bought into these things. But, you're not going to weather this storm in cryptocurrencies. It's like, people that went to Miami, that they went to Naples. I mean, Naples wasn't the place to be, right? These cryptocurrencies are like Naples. And actually, they're not like Naples. They're like Barbuda, right? They're like that island that got completely decimated. In fact, these cryptocurrencies could collapse before the dollar. So,
I just because you and I have had our tangles on cryptocurrencies before, I just wanted to point out that Peter and I strongly disagree on this, but I always appreciate the robust pushback. But I strongly disagree with you on cryptocurrencies. But let's talk about the natural disaster. Sorry, go ahead. You wanted to throw something in there? Come on, let's do it. Well, so these natural disasters that are occurring, it's funny. It's sort of like the termite thing. Like the house looks strong until there's, if there's a bunch of termites eating away at the foundations, that the house looks fine until there's a strong wind, right? Or until something happens. And the one thing that has troubled me is that the Fed over the last, you say over the last 100 years or so, but certainly over the last 10 years or so, it's sort of like, hey, I've got a toothache. I'll just take heroin, or I'll take morphine, or I'll take painkillers. And it's like, oh, look, my symptoms have gone away. But the rot spreads. And then by the time you do end up in the dentist chair, you have a lot more problems than just one rotten tooth. And that's sort of my concern, that some of the natural disasters, the expense that is going to be racked up, could be one of the things that reveals the weaknesses of the foundations.
Yeah, and we caught a break in that, we didn't get a direct hit on, Miami, and that hurricane didn't move up the East Coast and go through, all the expensive real estate that is there, right? Because, even though we had some damage on the west coast of Florida, it's not nearly as much real estate there, highly as developed as the other coast. But you're right. I mean, there's an old expression, right? You have to save for a rainy day. Well, I mean, we get a lot of rain when you get a hurricane. We have nothing saved. All the money that Trump wants to sprinkle down, right, on all the hurricane victims, we don't have any of it. We have to borrow that money. Borrow it from who? I mean, maybe the Fed's going to do a QE program just to come up with hundreds of billions of dollars for hurricane aid. And so, this is just another straw on the camel's back. And, you're right about the termite analogy. I think it's a very good analogy for our economy, because superficially, right, if the termites eat the house to the paint, but, you look at it, you don't know, the condition of that house. You don't realize how bad it is. And there are a lot of people that superficially just look at the United States, and they see a lot of people spending money and buying things. They think the economy is sound, but it's not. Beneath the surface, it's a disaster, and it's not going to take, a hurricane force wind to topple it at this point. And so, I think just the next recession is going to be all it takes. Whether these natural disasters are the catalyst. I mean, the catalyst for the 2001-2002 recession was the September 11th terrorist attack. So that was a man-made disaster. And so these are natural disasters, but, they could be the catalyst to finally tip us over the edge. And then we have to come up with a new stimulus program. And then that exposes all this. And as I said, if, the dollar starts to fall, it becomes the crisis. Consumer prices are already rising, and the weakening dollar is going to put more pressure on inflation. The hurricane has taken out a lot of supply, and if we have a lot more demand for construction, for raw materials, you could really start to see prices going up. And then what is the Fed going to do when inflation is well above 2%? They can't do anything, because if they raise rates, they collapse everything. So then they expose the box they're in, which is they can talk tough about fighting inflation, but if it ever rears its head, they have to back off and do nothing. And then that exposes their impotence, and then, creates even a bigger loss of confidence, and people run out of the dollar. And I think, they're going to run into gold. I mean, they're going to go into other currencies, but they're going to go into gold as an ultimate safe haven and store of value.
And, I mean, there are, of course, the natural disasters that are unpredictable, and then there are the inevitable mathematical disasters that are entirely predictable, right? So you pointed out recently in a tweet, America paid out over $432 billion in interest in 2016. It's on track to hit $460 billion in 2017. That's interest. That's not to reduce the deficit. That's not to pay off a single dime of the debt. That's merely interest payments, and that the water is coming in way faster than it can be bailed out.
But that's less than we paid in interest in 1980 when the national debt was under $1 trillion. So you can realize that the reason that the bill is so low, despite the mountain of debt being so high, is because the Fed has got interest rates so low. But if inflation picks up, if confidence goes down, and long-term interest rates ultimately rise, then imagine what happens to the cost. I mean, that was why we had the collapse in the housing market. One of the big reasons was the expiration of the teaser rate. So a lot of people bought houses, and they had an introductory mortgage where for the first couple of years, the payment was really low, and then after a couple of years, the payment jacked up. Well, the problem was people could afford the teaser rates. They couldn't afford the higher payments. Well, the same thing is going to happen. You know, we've got a teaser rate on the national debt. Well, if the debt resets at a higher interest rate, you know, we can no more afford to pay than those subprime borrowers. Now, of course, if we get the Fed to cooperate, then we don't need a real buyer. The Fed can keep printing money, and loaning it back to the government at a low rate of interest. But that's banana republic. I mean, when the markets figure this out, right, that's it. Then then the dollar's going to implode. And then it's a real crisis. I mean, again, it'll make 2008 look like a Sunday school day.
So there's the view from inside the bubble, which looks like a wonderful IMAX, the universe. It's distracting. Everything looks great. There are people dancing. And then there's a view from outside the bubble. And you've pointed out recently, foreign stocks are outperforming U.S. stocks because everyone's so excited that the Dow is hitting new highs. Now, I think that there's been some decent stuff that's come out of the current administration, some relaxation or repeal of certain regulations and so on. There's been some good stuff, but I don't think that's enough to drive the kind of economic growth that's being seen. So I want to, if you can help people to sort of understand how the bubble looks from outside the U.S., because you're not going to hear a lot about it from the mainstream media inside the U.S.
Yeah, well, I mean, there are bubbles everywhere. I mean, because central banks all around the world have kept interest rates too low. And so whenever you do that, you distort the economy, you create allocations of resources that would not take place if interest rates were set by the markets.
We've got, you got a bunch of European central banks with negative interest rates kicking around.
So mistakes are being made all around the world. Assets are being misallocated all around the world because of the meddling of foreign government central banks. But I just think that the damage is going to be particularly onerous in the United States. And obviously, I'm an American, and most of my clients are American, so I'm trying to do what I can to help Americans. Now, there are a lot of countries where the governments aren't doing this, and you have sounder economies, and a lot of these economies will benefit from a weakening dollar. I mean, people don't understand the degree to which the dollar has been used globally as a currency. A lot of countries borrow in dollars, right? I mean, all of our debt is in dollars, so our debt and our incomes are the same. But you have a lot of countries where their debt is in dollars, even though they don't earn dollars. Their governments can't print dollars. So when the dollar goes up, that's hard for a lot of countries because it means their debt is higher. It's harder to service it. It's harder to repay it. But as the dollar is going down, that is a gigantic stimulus for a lot of the world because it's like their debt is going away because they're earning their own currency, yet they're repaying dollars that are losing value. So it's like, a big reduction in your mortgage payment, your principal gets reduced. So a weak dollar is a big boom for a lot of the world. And also, if you think about all the global commodities that are priced in dollars, when the dollar is going up, that makes food more expensive for a lot of people. That makes energy more expensive. Well, the reverse, when the dollar is falling, those things become cheaper. So this is a benefit to the rest of the world because now they free up income to buy other things. If food is cheaper, if gas is cheaper, well, now I have more money to do other things. So the world is going to benefit, but America is going to suffer. People don't understand because the reason that Americans are able to enjoy the standard of living that we have, despite the fact that it's been falling, is because we're able to export dollars and import all kinds of things that we didn't make. But as the dollar really starts to fall, the price of those imports is going to go up dramatically. That's why I used to joke, that eventually going to Walmart is going to be like going to Saks Fifth Avenue, because the prices are going to be much higher. People are going to be shocked. I mean, we don't even need to have the Trump put on tariffs. The prices are going to go up without the tariffs. And then a lot of the stuff that we make ourselves is going to be expensive, because when the dollar plunges, we're going to start to export more. So that means some of the products that used to be available to Americans are going to be exported, and they're not going to be here anymore. Or if you're going to want to convince the exporter not to send them abroad, you're going to have to pay more money because he can make more money. So our whole standard of living is going to go down when we can no longer just print money. And ironically, we are actually hastening the dollar's demise by using the dollar as a club, and we're bludgeoning everybody with it. We're threatening everybody with sanctions. If you don't do what we want, we are going to punish you by restricting your access to the U.S. banking system. Yes, you're using dollars, and we're going to restrict your access to the Fed. You're not going to be able to use the wire, the SWIFT system. And countries are like, wait a minute, why are we giving America a weapon that they can use against us? China, Russia, they say, wait a minute, why are we going to empower the United States? Why are we going to give them this incredible gift of having the reserve currency if they're going to use it as a weapon? So you know what? Let's disarm them. Let's get away from the dollar. Let's find ways to transact without the dollar. And, we're just basically putting nails in our own coffin.
Right. And, of course, I think it has significant effects on foreign policy, America's influence in the world, if, you keep threatening people this way. And, of course, there's a bunch of dictators out there who are like, they look at what happened to Gaddafi, they look what happened to Saddam Hussein and so on. Just disarm and everything will be fine. And so America's losing leverage militarily, it's losing leverage economically, and I think culturally it's fairly dead that way as well. Which, I'm sort of half and half. I know that world's policeman thing is very seductive, but I think that money is better spent at home, and rather it's better left in the pockets of consumers and entrepreneurs and free market people to create jobs and improve the economy and so on. But so all of these things are going to end up better off for everyone in the long run. But the transition can be, it can be pretty rough, as we know historically.
Oh, yeah. I mean, and there's no precedent really for the scale of this problem. Right? And how big it is and how many countries are involved in it, and so people are just going to get blindsided because people, they have a lot of faith in this system, and they've known it their entire lives. I mean, most people alive today have no history of ever, being on a gold standard. They just, they've been using fiat currency, and the government's been able to borrow, and the debt's gone up to $20 trillion. And as far as everybody's concerned, it's fine. Now, you can actually look beneath the surface and say, wait a minute, before the government started doing this, I mean, we went off the gold standard in 1971, but you go back to the 1960s, the beginning of that decade, married women didn't work. Their husbands could afford to support them. People didn't have debt. People could afford to buy cars and pay cash. People didn't have credit cards. People saved for retirement. In fact, when they retired, they no longer had a mortgage because they paid off their house. So we used to have a higher standard of living. And despite the fact that we've invented more things, which is something that's always going to happen, now people are struggling. A guy can't support his wife, even if he has a master's degree. In fact, his wife has got a master's degree, and they're both working, and they have no assets. They both have student loans. They can't afford to have kids, or if they have a kid, maybe they have one. No one has big families anymore, right? I mean, who can afford that? People get married later, and they have tons of debt. They have nothing saved. I mean, how many people didn't even have insurance in this hurricane because they can't afford it, and because they assume the government's going to take care of them? So you got the moral hazard. But the whole standard of living has really gone down, and technology has been able to help us keep our heads above water. But we haven't had the real collapse yet. I mean, we haven't had what's coming. I mean, I think we can have a dollar crisis, and it'll look more like Venezuela. I mean, people experience a little bit of it when there's a hurricane, and we run out of food, we run out of gasoline. But what happens when the dollar crashes and we run out of all those things? We import a lot of our food. I mean, 90% of our seafood is imported, and even though we have a lot of farms, I mean, the farms need a lot of imported products. They need energy to operate those machines. The dollar crashes, we can't afford to buy. And then what happens if the government, seeing prices really start to rise, they put on price controls? Well, then, then you're really out of luck. I mean, so really things are going to happen that have never been experienced in America Maybe they've been experienced in lesser countries, but not a country of our status.
It's funny too, because so many people live on such a razor wire of income versus expenses. I mean, the studies I've seen, it's like significant proportions of Americans are like, one car repair bill away from just falling out of the middle class, or even the lower middle class. So people just don't have the reserves. They don't have the backup. So people have an inflated kind of income. And of course, as you know, half of Americans' households are significantly or totally dependent on the government for income, and they just don't have any savings. They don't have any backup. So there's not a lot of room to weather any kind of storm.
Yeah, back before the government created this welfare state, you go back to as late as the 50s or 60s, and if a guy was married and had a few kids, assuming he lost his job, he had plenty of savings, right, to weather while he was looking for another job. And, he could always get a part-time job while he was looking for a full-time job. And his wife, who didn't have a job, she could take a part-time job. It's like you had somebody on the bench who could pitch in. Sometimes women would take a secretarial job or something to help make ends meet, but while the husband was looking for another real job. So you had somebody who could come off the bench. You had a lot of savings. Today, if a guy loses his job, first of all, his wife is already working. She can't get another job, and they have no savings. So they have nothing. All they have is the ability to use their credit cards. But a lot of people who have no savings are also in debt. So what do? You lose your job and you're in debt. Right? Or if you have a natural disaster, something bad happens to your house, you've got no money. Nobody saves anything. And in fact, the government tries to encourage people not to save, because anytime people start saving, they think that's a problem. Oh, we got to stimulate the economy. The consumer's not spending enough. He's saving too much. Quick, let's try to figure out a way to get people to go deeper into debt. That's our whole economic philosophy. More and more debt.
Well, and of course, the government loves it when people spend in the here and now, because that stimulates jobs and economic activity right now. Governments think in terms of quarters, but of course, entrepreneurs have like their 5-year plans, their 7-year plans, and so on. So when people are spending and they're draining money out of the banks, there's less money available for entrepreneurs to create new jobs, for upgrade, to become more efficient, to make the labor value of the employees richer, and so on. And so this is the problem with politicians, is they're always trying to stimulate things in the here and now rather than actually building the foundation for a solid and growing economy in the future.
That's because their horizon is the next election, right? There's always an election every 2 years. So they only think short term. It's what can we do to make things look as good as possible before the next election so I can get reelected. But all of this is undermining the long term. But they don't think long term because their terms are not long enough, or they're not limited. I mean, if we had term limits or something, then if they knew they had to leave, then they might be more inclined to actually do something good. But a lot of these politicians want to spend their life there. And so it's always getting from one election to the next. And if there's a crisis, we'll deal with that after the election. But in the meantime, how do we get to the next election? So it's all about artificial stimulus. It's all about boosting the economy. Like in your example with the dentist, they never want to go to the dentist because they don't want to deal with the pain, or they don't want to have to get so by the time they go there, all their teeth are rotten, and it's total. You need a complete, all artificial teeth installed. I mean, you're done, right? And that's because nobody wants to tell the American public you got a cavity. It says, no, don't worry, just keep eating chocolates and everything is great.
Just suck on this face tube and everything will be fine. Now, let's talk a little bit about something that shows up every single natural disaster, and it's going to show up, of course, in the next one and the next one and the next one. Price gouging. Oh, no, they're overcharging for water when there's no water around and so on. And to me, it's like, well, I'd rather actually the prices be higher, because what that's going to draw people's attention in. They're going to try and ship more water, and it's going to drive the prices back down. A spike in prices is the market's way of saying there's a huge demand and people are going to rush in to fill it and drive it back down. And yet it is considered to be the most evil thing to charge more than $1 for a bottle of water for people who are really thirsty in a natural disaster.
Yeah, this is all this nonsense about appealing to people's economic ignorance, like the minimum wage. I mean, nobody should profit from the hurricane. Why not? I mean, it's like saying nobody should profit from people's being sick. Oh, why not? I mean, I want somebody to get really rich curing cancer. Wouldn't that be great? Somebody could get rich finding a cure for cancer. Listen, nobody should be able to get rich because of people with cancer. Okay, fine. Then no one's going to spend any time or money trying to cure it. look.
Well, we're going to, let's say somebody spends $100 million finding a cure for cancer, which then saves how many tens or hundreds of billions of dollars a year for the entire economy. I mean, everybody ends up better off when there's a strong profit incentive, but somehow it's gouging. And it's like, well, why didn't you store up some water? You live in a hurricane district. I mean, it's a tax on people who don't plan, which reminds them to plan.
But you know what you could do? If you were allowed to sell water for higher prices, more stores would stockpile it because they knew, hey, I'm going to have some extra water just in case there's a hurricane and I can charge more for it. But if you can't do it, then why go to the added expense of storing it up? I mean, that even happens too. There's a lot of like gas stations. If they had their own generators, then they can get gas during a power outage. But they're not allowed to charge more, so they're not going to make the investment, in the generator or the extra storage if they can't charge a premium when there's short supply. So you don't get the supply. Prices is a way to allocate resources and ration. So let's say in a hurricane and people want to run to the store and buy extra water. Well, if the price of water doesn't go up, people will just, let me buy as much as I can carry out. Even if I don't need it, I mean, it doesn't go bad. I'll just have it for the next hurricane. But if you let the store raise the price and maybe water is $10 a bottle, all right, I'm not going to buy this expensive water now. I'm just going to buy what I need. That way you don't run out. And that way somebody else could get water instead of showing up to a sign, no water. And then what ends up happening is the legitimate merchant can't charge more, but now there's a black market. Some guy's like, hey, come over here. I got some water for you, and they gouge them. Because a lot of these stores, they lose a lot of other money during the hurricane. I mean, let them make a little extra selling their products, because what if there's a bunch of damage? They got to repay it. Or so let them make a little extra money selling the things. Let everything be rationed so that people don't run out and people don't stock up and buy things. This whole idea that we can't charge people more money, it is complete nonsense. And worst case scenario, you know what a supermarket could do? If at the end of the day it raises its prices, doesn't run out of merchandise, and it doesn't have tremendous losses, it can take those extra profits and donate them to hurricane relief. If they want to let the public image, hey, I didn't make any money, I didn't profit off of this. Look, we took all the money, because it's better than just having a few people rush in and buy everything, and then you run out of everything. Right?
Well, and then those people will simply resell to other more needy people. And anyway, so now let's talk a little bit about something that you've certainly discussed before, Peter, and it's one of the bubbles that people don't see, which is higher education, like over $1 trillion in student loans for some, I don't know, economically questionable job skills, such as, I now hate capitalism. I'm having trouble finding a job in the free market. So some of the diversion of, precious capital from, say, manufacturing or entrepreneurship into these Marxist money pit fire sales of higher education, I think people don't really recognize how dangerous and difficult it is for the economy, not just in terms of the content of what's taught to the kids, but all of the opportunity costs of where else that capital and those job skills could have been created.
I think for most people, going to college is probably the worst financial decision they can make, because they are going to spend some of the formative years of their lives, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, where, they can still live at home. They don't have a big overhead. They can afford to take a lower paying job, because what's more important is getting the work experience, getting the skills, getting the connections, learning what they're good at, getting into the real world and working. Instead, they spend those 4, 5, 6 years getting drunk, going to parties, right, and taking a bunch of worthless liberal arts courses. And they get out and they know absolutely nothing. In fact, in many cases, they've been brainwashed, and they actually know less than when they got in, because they learned a bunch of stuff that's all wrong.
Well, there's actually studies that show that people who've taken a year of economics end up scoring less well on general economics knowledge than those who've never been exposed to it, because you at least have the common sense of the real world, but you get into the indoctrination mill of leftist economics and you come out not knowing your ass from a hole in the ground.
They wring all that common sense out of your head. And so then, like when you graduate, though, now let's say you graduate, you're 23, 24 years old, you don't know how to do anything, you've never had a job. And now you have $50,000 to $100,000 in debt. Now what are you going to do? A lot of people don't. At that point, they just move back with their parents. Like, I can't afford to work because I have to start paying these loans. You certainly can't afford to go into business for yourself. That's why entrepreneurship in America is the lowest it's ever been, because our young people have too much debt to go out and start a need savings to start a business, and we're graduating all these kids with a bunch of debt. Look, when my father, who recently passed away, but when my father went to college, he didn't have to borrow any money, but his parents didn't have any money. So how did he go to college? He got a summer job, and that's what all of his friends did. There was the expression, I'm working my way through college. And so you graduated college with no debt, and it wasn't expensive. And when my dad went to college, most people didn't go. Most people finished high school, and then they got a job.
Yeah, it was like 10% of people in the 50s went to college or so. It's pretty rare.
Yeah, so when you went to college, you actually had a degree that was kind of rare. It meant something, right? Oh, yeah, I'm a college man. You went to college, right? Now it's like they give them out like chewing gum. Everybody's got a college degree. So now you got to go get a master's degree. You got to get a PhD. How much is that going to cost you? Right? You go rack up those bills. We got people graduating with $200,000 of student loans. That's like a mortgage.
Well, and the opportunity costs, especially if you're going to go do a PhD, that can take you 10, 12, 14 years. All of the opportunity costs of burning through money rather than earning money is really hard to justify. And unless the PhD is going to get you to be chairman of the Fed, it's really tough to justify.
Most people, look, if I had a choice between hiring two people in most businesses, right, a kid that graduated high school and spent the last 4 or 5 years working and gaining some, and I can actually see his work experience and what he's done and what he's learned, I'd rather hire that guy than a kid who's never worked and who's got a philosophy degree. I mean, what does that prove? What does that show me? It doesn't show me anything, right? I mean, so for most, now, if you want to be a doctor, there are certain occupations where you got to go to college, and if you're a really smart kid and you've got, straight A's and you've got 1600s on your SATs and you know that college, you want to, there's certain things, but fine. But the vast majority of people, the C students, the B students, the guys who are going to junior college, community college, what the hell? They're wasting their time. They're wasting their money. They could be out in the real world. And, even if you get an internship and work for free, it's better than paying tuition to learn nothing. Go to some company and say, hey, let me work for free. What can I do? Let somebody see you. Absorb what you can. You're like a sponge. You're 18. Learn, right? And some of the richest men, on my video, and I talked about it on your show before, but on YouTube, if you go to Peter Schiff, college degree, is it worth it? Where I go down Bourbon Street, New Orleans, and I talk to all the people working there who have college degrees, and all of them have menial jobs that they don't need degrees for. But on that video, I mentioned that the richest Americans that have ever lived, Rockefeller, Carnegie, who's the other one? I forget the third one.
You mean like a robber baron, like Mellon or something like that?
Yeah, but it wasn't Mellon. But the three richest Americans that have ever lived, adjusted for inflation. I mean, way richer than Bill Gates. None of them went to college. I mean, some of them dropped out of elementary school. I mean, none of them even finished high school, and they became multi-billionaires, and they all started with minimum wage type jobs. None of them inherited money. Their children inherited money, and their grandchildren. But these guys that originally earned this money, they came from humble beginnings, and they started in the mailroom, and they worked their way up. So you don't need to go to school. And in fact, today, I think college is even less useful because you can use the internet to learn so much. I mean, you can educate yourself. You don't need to pay a college to educate you. People say, oh, Peter, you're anti-education. I'm not anti-education. I think people should learn. What I'm against is these government-run schools that just steal your money and don't educate you. They brainwash you. They teach you nonsense. They're more concerned about not offending anybody than actually educating people these days. So educate yourself. I mean, a lot of the founding fathers were self-educated men, and they were a lot better educated than people today who've gone to college in the United States. So I am very pro-education. I'm just anti-government. I don't want government doing it. I mean, I'd like to get the government out of K through 12. I'd like to let people go to private schools. Get the government out of this business because they don't give a damn about the kids. They run the schools for the benefit of the administrators, for the benefit of the teachers. No one even cares about the kids because the kids are a captive audience. They're a monopoly, and they're not there to make a profit. See, when people say, well, we don't want people making a profit on education. Why not? We'll give better education. Whenever somebody makes a profit, that means you get something better, right? People wanting a profit they have to do two things. They have to give you a good product at a low price because they have to win your business over your competitor. Government schools can give you a lousy product at a high price, and they don't give a damn. Right? So
well, and there's been a lot of studies that have shown that if you really want to figure out how well someone's going to perform in a job, a couple of hour IQ test is the most reliable thing that you can possibly get over the long run. And of course, for most American businesses, it's either illegal to run an IQ test on potential employees, or it's strongly discouraged, or you might get sued. And so basically these big giant educational institutions are now like these ridiculous multi-year IQ tests to make, to try and replicate what a standard IQ test could give you in a couple of hours with no doubt.
They're not even an IQ test. I mean, because there's a lot of grade inflation there, and a lot of people cheat on their exams, and the exams a lot of them are easy because the colleges just want to graduate everybody. They don't want them all flunking out. But yes, I mean, if you graduate at the top of your class from Harvard or Yale, yeah, you're probably pretty smart. But from the majority of colleges, I mean, it's nothing. And it's like we don't need somebody to spend 5 or 6 years just to get the credit. I mean, they could just have a basic skills exam, not even an IQ test. They could just give you a test and say, how did you pass on that test as a screening? I mean, it's a very expensive way to screen kids by saying, oh, I got a degree. And plus, a lot of people can just make it up. I mean, how many people, if you told your potential employer that you went to, some college in Iowa or Nebraska, would they even check? I mean, if you say, yeah, I went to Yale. Okay, did he really go to Yale? But so everybody goes to college. What's the big deal? I mean, saying you went and actually went. I mean, there's probably a lot of people who have said they went to college who didn't go. And then, what if somebody said, what if you have to be a college grad to get into a job, right? And so you lie on your application. You say, I went to college. You really didn't, right? And let's say you're working there for a few years and you're doing a great job. Are they really going to fire you because you pretended you were? No, why would they care? I mean, it's just college is about getting your first job, right? Once you got your first job, your second job is not where did you go to college. It's what are you doing now? What was your last job? So you only needed to get your first job, right? But, if you start a lower down, I mean, there are a lot of people, let's say there's a college, they want a college degree for the job and it pays, $35,000 a year. So go apply for that job out of high school and say, you know what? I'll do it for $15,000. I'll do it for minimum wage. How much worse can it be? Look, here's my GPA. I got straight A's. I took, I could easily go to college if I wanted to, but I'd rather have this minimum wage job because I don't want to spend all this money on a college degree. Give me a shot. You can get me cheaper. Anyway, and there's a lot of ways for young kids. I mean, these colleges always want to pretend that, if you don't go to college, you throw your life away, and they have these phony statistics about how much more money the college grads earn than the non-college grads. Yeah, sure, but the people who go to college are not earning more money because they went to college. It's faulty logic. If you look at the kids that go to college out of high school, they're the smarter kids, they're harder working, they're more ambitious, they're more dedicated. That's why they earn more money, not because they wasted 5-6 years in college, but because of the other characteristics that they had that made them choose college. So
yeah, it's like me saying, well, if only somebody would cast me in a hair commercial. I have long flowing locks of lustrous hair. It's like, that's how, hey, draft me on the basketball team. I'm sure I'll get 1.5 feet taller, no problem. So let's close off with an argument that recently I saw you being interviewed and you weren't allowed to finish the argument. Always drives me crazy because, agree, disagree, but at least hear it out. And the argument was, hey, Peter, what do you mean low taxes lead to economic growth? Don't you remember in the 1950s there were these massive income taxes and there was huge economic growth? So let's crank up taxes on the rich and have a vibrant and flourishing economy.
Yeah, that's another example of faulty logic, right? I mean, you can't just think that two things happen at the same time and the one caused the other. So you can't say, we had strong economic growth in the 50s and we also had high taxes. Therefore, it was the high taxes that caused that growth. The reality of it is that America's economic might on a relative basis peaked in the 1950s. And it's been downhill from there. And the reason was because of the introduction of these taxes. Because before the 1950s, very few Americans even paid income taxes. It was the victory tax in the Second World War that Americans started paying taxes. But we built this country without an income tax. Those robber barons paid no income taxes, right? We didn't pay any income taxes at all in the 19th century. And not in the beginning of the 20th century. And then it started in 1913, and then they started jacking it up. But the average American didn't even pay any taxes at all until the Second World War. So that was up until the mid-1940s. So these high taxes were a new thing in the 1950s. But America was already rich from all the years of low taxes. But here's what started in the 1950s. Americans started thinking about how to avoid taxes rather than how to make money. That's when the Japanese and the Germans started to eat our lunch, because we owned all the manufacturing businesses. We made everything. Nobody would buy anything made in Germany or Japan. But what happened is, in the 1950s and 1960s, while our businesses were trying to avoid taxes, they were trying to make money because they had much lower taxes than we did. And that was the beginning of the end. That was when our standard of living started to go down. People were trying to avoid these 70% taxes.
And I just want to point out that you sort of Germany and Japan, the enemies in World War II got really, really low taxes, and the winner of World War II got crushingly high taxes. And that's what you don't call victory in a sane world. Sorry, Peter, go ahead.
Yes, they got freedom and low taxes, and we basically got big government. Now, of course, some of the losers, like East Germany, right, they got stuck with the Soviet system, right? So they didn't get the benefit of the low taxes that the West Germans had or the Japanese had. So they were able to get out of a gigantic hole, but they eventually passed us. So by the 1980s, right, they dominated. And so to say, oh, these high taxes were good, that's what destroyed our economy. What built our economy was no taxes, low taxes. So that's what we need to go back to. If we want to have vibrant economic growth, if we want to get out of this hole, we need to slash taxes. But in order to do that, we need to slash government spending. I mean, you hear Donald Trump, he's out today, he's talking about, I want tax cuts for the middle class. We can't afford tax cuts for the middle class. If we don't cut government spending, we need to raise taxes on the middle class. But no one wants to say that. So if we really want to reduce the burden on the middle class, and I'm all for that, but I want to reduce the burden on everybody. I don't want class warfare. Let's get rid of the income tax, or at least have a flat tax. But if we want lower taxes, we need smaller government. So what are we going to cut? What programs are we going to get rid of? Right? How are we going to afford this? Because if we just borrow the difference, if we just have bigger government but pay for it with debt, that's worse than paying for it with taxes. That's going to be even more expensive.
Well, it's so frustrating as well, because thinking of sort of the magic White House chair or whatever you could do is so frustrating. You say, okay, I'm going to lay off all of these government employees. Well, is that going to save you money? I'm not sure, because then they go on unemployment insurance, they go on disability, and you're just paying through a different mechanism. So I think it's really, really tough to get any kind of short-term savings out of government. I mean, you could sell off a bunch of federal land and buildings, and I think that would help, and also transfer them to more productive uses. But it's really tough to get short-term savings in government because there are all of these support mechanisms for people who lose their jobs.
There's probably a lot of government workers who are getting paid $100,000 a year, $150,000 a year that we don't need, and they wouldn't collect that much in unemployment compensation. So we'd still save some money if we got rid of a lot of government workers. But, we have to cut government pensions for workers who are retired and collecting pensions. We don't have the money to pay it. We've got to make cuts to current entitlements. People who are getting Social Security checks, have to be told that they're going to get smaller checks or no checks.
Okay, I'm going to stop it right there. What he's talking about there at the end is, the simple fact that we have a whole bunch of promises that should have never been made in the first place. We do owe an extent of the promises, but at the end of the day, we don't have the money. And we're only making this worse. And when something that I've talked about, even under Obama, is you have the Russians, you have the Chinese, you have, other countries and oil countries that are working to trade oil and trade other commerce in something other than the U.S. dollar, to create that already established backdoor, waiting for the collapse of the U.S. dollar as a petrodollar and the world reserve currency. And they're already making those steps. They've been making those steps for years now. And when we add this much to our debt, now being over $20 trillion in debt, it just makes that ability for them to, go along, with these plans. You're only given them the opportunity by continuing to raise the debt ceiling. But Ron Paul's talked about it before about, how you're going to have to default on certain things. There's things that you're going to have to chalk up and be like, it's just not getting paid. We have to take what we are bringing in. We have to, basically wipe the books. And other countries aren't going to like it. We're not going to like it. But if we did it, it'd be one thing. If another country does it because they have a reserve currency that will be able to withstand a blow by a world economic collapse, and a lot of people have speculated Russia buying gold and China buying so much gold and silver is to back this new currency and, have more support. I have an article. This is out of foxnews.com in the opinions section. Give me a second here. Sorry, I had a sneeze. Oh, wow. This one, foxnews.com opinion section. Ron Paul. Crony defense budget hands SpaceX a monopoly. Why? Does it freeze up here? Behind the high-minded rhetoric surrounding many government programs, there often, or even usually, lies some grant of special privilege to a powerful business interest. The most well-known example, of course, is Obamacare's individual mandate creating a guaranteed market for insurance companies. However, the most common hiding place for corporate welfare is the Pentagon. Hawkish politicians love sticking gifts to big corporations in a in the yearly National Defense Authorization Act, NDAA. So it is no surprise to find an example of cronyism in the fiscal year 2018 NDAA, which the Senate is expected to vote on this week. Specifically, Section 1615 on this year's NDAA expressly forbids the Air Force from developing new launch vehicles by restricting expenditures to the development of new engines or the modification of existing systems. This prohibition is supposedly designed to address the Russian threat, a threat manufactured by those seeking a new Cold War. In addition to flaming anti-Russia hysteria, this provision makes the company SpaceX the only affordable option for launch services. For obvious political reasons, Washington wants to phase out the use of Russian-manufactured RD-180 rocket engines. However, as former Air Force Secretary Deborah Lee James made clear, the Department of Defense would strongly prefer to not have to pay for the development of an RD-180 engine replacement that would benefit only one launch service provider. The union between politicians seeking to grow the welfare state and businesses seeking special favors from government solidifies the forces of big government's control of Capitol Hill, allowing SpaceX to obtain a monopoly over launch services harms taxpayers much more than forbidding the Pentagon from purchasing Russian products harms Vladimir Putin. And this provision becomes law, SpaceX will be able to charge the government more than they could even a quasi-competitive market. This monopoly will also stifle innovation in rocket launching technology. Despite the numerous public statements by SpaceX CEO Elon Musk decrying crony capitalism, SpaceX would not exist without government contracts and subsidies. According to Wall Street Journal, government contracts account for about 70% of SpaceX contracts. U.S. taxpayers have provided SpaceX more than $5.5 billion in the form of Air Force and NASA contracts. SpaceX's reliance on government subsidies led it to behave in ways that distort the political and policy process. Companies like SpaceX have an incentive to invest in lobbyists and campaign contributions to keep the government money flowing. These companies shower their largest on powerful politicians whose political and ideological agenda dovetails with the company's demand for taxpayer subsidies. The union between politicians seeking to grow the welfare state and businesses seeking special favors from government solidifies the forces of big government control of Capitol Hill. A perfect example of how this system works against the taxpayer is the relationship between SpaceX and Senate Armed Services Committee Chairman John McCain. Elon Musk is a generous donor to both Senator McCain's campaigns and the McCain Institute, while Senator McCain has in the past been a lead sponsor of provisions that would give SpaceX a monopoly on launch services. I do not mean to suggest that Senator McCain is helping start a nuclear war. To receive donations from SpaceX, anyone who knows John McCain knows he does not need financial incentives to promote a belligerent foreign policy. Rather, SpaceX supports John McCain because his policy preferences coincide with their business interests. I rarely agree with Pentagon officials, and it is rare that I am on the same side of questions involving military spending as President Trump. However, the President and the Pentagon brass are correct in that this protectionist provision should be removed from the NDAA. It poisons relations between the U.S. and Russia to benefit one company. Killing this piece of cronyism would be a great way to start draining the swamp. And again, that was Ron Paul, FoxNews.com, opinions section. You can also find it at RonPaulLibertyReport.com. And, time after time, we always have politicians decide, we're going to talk a really, really, really good talk. Every election cycle ends up this way. Look what, George Bush ran on, the Constitution, small government, all this good stuff, but in the end, after 9/11, he was able to get the police state enacted, and, it doesn't matter what they say on their campaign. I always look at it as, I really think that when it's so public, that there should be an ability to have some ability to challenge these politicians when they don't go along with it, because, people go, well, it's not a contract. Well, in a way, it is when you're soliciting for, just like if I went around trying to sell something, and you hand me the money for what I'm trying to sell you, and you never receive that. In a way, your vote is you purchasing that candidate, and when they don't do what they say they're going to do, it's so public when it's on record what they say most of the time. Definitely in today's age, there should be able to be more accountability. There is a verbal contractual agreement in a way. And I guess the argument comes down to, do they mean it? When they say, I'm going to lower taxes, are they really saying they're going to lower taxes, or they're saying, that's what I want to fight for? And that's where a big argument comes down on that issue. Ramifications from that, too, are a contributing factor to a lot of the issues we've dealt with. We're going to play a short clip here. Ron Paul, and he's speaking on politicians lying, and gets kind of down into why they get away with it.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. Today, the co-host is Chris Rossini, calling in from New Jersey. Chris, welcome to the program.
Great to be with you, Dr. Paul.
Our program today is going to be why politicians lie. I think it'd be pretty easy to just explain this. Politicians lie because government has a bunch of liars. But it's not quite so easy. A little more complicated, and that's simplistic. Besides, a lot of politicians I've known over the years don't even know they're lying. They've been influenced by what they accept as conventional wisdom. Well, this is what politicians do. They have to sort of fudge a little bit. They need to spin a little bit. A little demagoguery doesn't hurt anything. And our job is to take care of the people. And sometimes, the people can't handle the truth. So I think they put that together and they rationalize it. They they would never think they're a bunch of liars. Even if they say that, we bend the Constitution a little bit, but they don't consider taking the oath and not even paying any attention as a lie and breaking an oath. They just totally ignore it because the people don't seem to hold them accountable. But there are so many things when you start thinking about this on where government is deceitful and how they mislead the people. But I think there's one broad principle that we should think about, and that is, what is government based on? Government is based on aggression, and that is the use of force. And so the government doesn't want to tell the people that everything they do is aggression. They have to conceal what they're actually doing by telling a lie and misleading people, say, we're really good people. These aren't lies, and this is not aggression. And then after a while, after these lies are told, there's more need for aggression, because they have to maintain the lies. So it's a pyramid scheme in the building of violence coming from our government. And all we have to do is look at the pyramid originally started even back at the time right after the Constitution was signed, and certainly in the 20th century. Government size and scope is pyramiding, just like the debt is pyramiding and all these other things. But it's based on that principle. And quite frankly, we're going to talk about the particular things about why and what government does and the politicians do when they lie. But overall, I think that this problem can't be solved unless people understand the nature of government, what the government should be doing. And you can't have a government force and condone the force, but not understand why they have to do a little fibbing, because quite frankly, the politician wouldn't do well if they were quite frank and told the people exactly the truth when it comes to economic matters, personal liberties, and foreign policy. That would be something that they just couldn't handle. So, Chris, I'm sure you've thought about this a little bit. What do you think of all this?
Yeah, especially when politicians campaign. I mean, they're not under oath. There are no contracts, no binding agreements between what they're saying to the crowds and what they have to do when they get in office. There's really no obligation to come through on anything that they say. Legally, they can say whatever they want. And so in that situation, the game becomes, well, tell people what they want to hear so they'll pull my name in the booth. And that's really all that matters. And then once you're in, you're under no obligation to do any of it. And obviously, we've seen politicians do that. Now, politicians are not a special breed. All of us have the ability to lie. We're all free. So some of us will choose to tell the truth. And there will always be some people that will choose to lie. But outside of government, you at least have some control on how to react to it. If you know someone that lies, you can stay away from that person, not trust them. If a business lies to you, there's legal recourse, and you could stop doing business with them. You could immediately do something. But Dr. Paul, once we elect someone, it's 4 years, 6 years. Can't the government distract you in the meantime? So there's really no recourse on what we can do.
Well, the theory is that you have recourse at the polls. And what you describe is true, but I think that's coming to an end because the politician and the governments have been able to get away with this, especially in the United States, because we've been a very wealthy country. We had a powerful currency. We've been able to get away with inflation. And people then didn't worry about it because the politicians were very generous. Now they can't be quite so generous. You know, one thing, though, that sort of caught my attention when I was in Washington is why is there no remorse, when they make mistakes, they make false promises, or they devise an economic system that doesn't quite work. And today we have this tremendous number of people that are underemployed or unemployed. And they start wars that a lot of people die, a lot of innocent people that we kill, a lot of our people die and suffer. The consequences and successes are so poor. And you take the Bush era and this acceptance of a preemptive war. You think, oh, my goodness, I've made a mistake. And millions of people have died for this. I really didn't mean to do this. I wanted to remake the Middle East and make it a wonderful, nice place. And it hasn't happened. That never crosses their mind. They do not suffer from that because I believe that the politicians I knew are sort of sociopathic. They're immune from this self-assessment. It's not complete. It's not total because I did meet some people. Matter of fact, I met some in Washington that decided that maybe fiat currency doesn't make sense and we should look at sound money. Others have looked at foreign policy and said, hey, Ron, you're probably you're right on this thing, that these wars are really stupid. But then they also, the big conflict for our politicians in Washington is they have been conditioned all their life, certain economic rules and laws in their education. The more education they have, the more adamant they are because they have been taught Keynesian economics, that it's okay to do this. It's proper. It's moral. More people are taken care of, and we have to help the poor, and on and on. A socialist never feels badly about what they're advocating, even though it's based on violent force of government to forcibly redistribute the wealth and make people a lot poorer. They never do that because the intellectuals are behind them and say, this is what you learn. I got an A because I was able to, recite this to the professor, and now I'm doing it. And then they find excuses, and every once in a while you come up with a politician that writes books about excuses on why things didn't quite go the way they thought. So I think that is part of the problem. But there are some specific things I'm sure you're aware of that government goes out and they go out of their way to mislead the people.
Oh, of course. It's all the time. Unfortunately, politicians, they learn from if lying equals success in getting elected, they don't have a change of heart and say, okay, that's it. I'm telling the truth from now on. No, they continue to lie while they're in office. No matter who's in office, the economy is great. Obama's telling us the economy is great. Trump said, no, it isn't. Now Trump says, yes, it is. So they're always fabricating things. And there's no inflation, yet our bills, when I see my bills constantly rising, I'm not supposed to trust my own eyes. They tell me there's no inflation. Right. And we're always winning. And so it continues beyond just the campaign. While they're in office, it's lying equals success. And it's pretty backwards.
A little bit more that goes along with what I was saying is, the politician actually, they learn to lie to themselves. If they can't be true to themselves, they can lie to everybody else and it doesn't bother them. But the other thing is a monetary factor and also the benefits to the politician, because basically they're rewarded for lying. If you know how to do this and fib and get by and make rash promises and not be held to account, you progress and you stay in office, you get elected and you become chairman, and you have to know how to do this. You have to raise money, so you get rewarded for spinning the lies and kowtowing to the special interest. In contrast to this, what if you're a whistleblower? And last weekend when we had our meeting in Alexandria at Dulles Airport, we talked to whistleblowers and they suffered. So telling the truth is a cost. And yet if you tell a lie, you get rewards. You say, all right, do this. Get me this contract. Yeah, I know we don't need this bomber, even if it is a weapon that's outdated 50 years. It's good for jobs, and they rationalize, and then they get a good donation. So unfortunately, the situation we have today that exists, that you are literally financially or politically rewarded, for lying. And then after you leave Congress, I always considered Congress as a schooling for the lobbyists. Just think how many end up in Washington. That's always a good test. When your congressman retires, if he says, I'm staying in Washington, I'm not going back home again, that means he's part of the system and he will benefit materially from this. So it's there's a lot of things, and they can make that subconscious. Oh no, I wouldn't do that. That's not the reason I do it. We really need all these weapons. Yes, we need to be in the Middle East to protect our liberties, and we need this to make us safe and secure and protect our Constitution. And they recite that over and over again. There's this belief, and it seems to work. Repetition will convince the people. But repetition doesn't make something true. It may deceive people, but it doesn't reveal the truth by just repeating a bunch of lies.
Yes, and it's amazing, Dr. Paul, that with this long history of lying, there's never a shortage of believers. Every election, it's hysteria, and nobody remembers. This time, I guess, is going to be different, but it never is different. And when we have 300 million people, there's only so many people that one can know in your life that you could be close with, that are close to you. So it's always a shock. This president he's only thinking about himself and the people that are closest to him. Well, yeah, that's he can't. How can you possibly represent 300 million people? It's a fairy tale. So what's the upside to this, Dr. Paul? Now we seek a society of liberty. Shouldn't, if government was restricted to just protecting our liberty, wouldn't we be much better off?
Oh, obviously so, and that is the answer, because that isn't micromanaging a person's finances, micromanaging a person's personal habits or religious habits, not micromanaging the internal and external affairs of other nations, and yet this has to be portrayed as something very necessary. I think the other factor that politicians have learned to use is fear. Fear in economic policy. When the crisis hit in 2009, believe me, there was a lot of fear in Washington, and it ushered in this unbelievable age of QEs, which has given us trillions and trillions of dollars worth of debt and printing of money, which has yet to be resolved. But building up fear, whether it's economic or in foreign policy. I mean, the American people, it took 8-10 months to get the American people behind going after Saddam Hussein because he had a nuclear weapon. He participated in 9/11. We got to do this because he might attack us. He's been gassing his own people. All a bunch of lies. But the people have to have be very fearful. And it's an ongoing thing. We've taken care of Saddam Hussein and bin Laden and all these things that they have to say, well, it's terrorism. It's terrorism. No matter what the incident, it's terrorism, which the people envision, oh, somebody invaded our country and they're causing our trouble. But, you know, the numbers of people in our country since 9/11 that have been killed by foreigners coming in for religious radical reasons that have killed America, it's minuscule. It's minuscule, and yet the image is so different. But the propaganda is there by the executive branch, the legislative branch, and certainly part of what we're talking about has to be confirmed by our media. Feed into it and to tell these lies and perpetuate the lies, whether it's economic lies or whether it's foreign policy lies. But Chris, did anything come to your mind about some of the economic fallacies, some of the economic reports they give us in order to deceive us into thinking that everything is just okay?
Oh, of course. As I mentioned earlier, with inflation, we hear with unemployment. I mean, I just know from looking around the people that I know that it's not rosy. I mean, people have jobs, but people are struggling. But we're told to look at the Dow, and that's as long as the Dow is going up, that's supposedly our savior. But the boots on the ground read, at least from my perspective, is that it's not as great as they say it is. But there's so many distractions to keep us occupied, that, as you mentioned with the media. I mean, they could just pull another Kathy Griffin out, and that'll keep everybody occupied for the next few days. And they're expert at this. North Korea, there's always something to keep our eyes off of, our own struggling situations. So, I mean, my closing thought would be that stick with the truth, number one, and always push for a government that doesn't have so much influence and control. And then we don't have to worry about whether they're truthful or liars. They're powerless to begin with. And so what do you think, Doctor?
Well, it's hard to say that this was a message of optimism. I described Washington and all the lying going on, all the problems we have. We're running out of money. We're in debt. We're in wars and all of it. And yet there is something to look at that is very positive, because statistically, the American people don't believe the government anymore. Just think of what's happened since we had the Kennedy Commission studying about the Kennedy assassination. At that time, everybody knew Oswald was guilty, and that's it. Now it's like 80% of the people don't believe the government report. Same way with 9/11. I'm pretty surprised about that. But think of the lies that have been told about 9/11 and Saudi Arabia and all this going on, and yet we're still bosom buddies with Saudi Arabia. And they're our best friends. And yet the American people now, by a large majority, believe there's something going on. The Congress voted unanimously to allow the American people to challenge the Saudi government because of their possible participation in 9/11. So the commissions don't work. The American people are alert. They don't trust. Right now, I think there were a lot of people praying and hoping that cleaning out the swamp and a new president would change things. I think right now there's some discouragement on this, that maybe that's just not going to happen. But I blame it on not looking at the fundamentals. The force of government, what is it based on? It's based on a lie. It is not a proper purpose in a free society. The purpose of government ought to be to protect liberty and let people take care of themselves. That is the society that I will continue to work for. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.
Ron Paul Liberty Report, RonPaulLibertyReport.com, and Ron Paul Liberty Report on YouTube. Check them out. Subscribe. Now, I really don't meet too many people like, oh, yeah, I trust in government, until I get into the trendy groups. When I find a trendy group, the ones that have to look ridiculous, but not judging. When you're young, you tend to dress a little crazy. You know, the attention grabbing clothes. It don't matter what generation you came from. You were always pushing the limits of what's acceptable and what's cool. And really, there's been kind of a reversal in a lot of that, where now you have people wearing suspenders with, you know, older looking clothes. Sometimes it is old vintage clothes that they specifically go to thrift shops to find. But when you find those groups, that's when you tend to find the all-knowing group of people that each one of them are all-knowing, except they start arguing with each other. And a lot of times you can sit back and watch them argue. Now, where that won't play a part in is if they think you're the opposition, one. Two, at a demonstration. Because then they need to stay in line, stay in formation. Can't go out of that. And you see that happen time and time again. Where it doesn't matter if it's left-leaning media or right-leaning media, when they actually try to bring up legitimate, you know, questions and stuff, there's no actual response. It's just chants and, you know, talking point, if you can even call it that. Chanting point, maybe. But when you look at where the politicians are, and it doesn't matter if they're on the left or on the right, they always agree to write themselves out of laws. They always agree on the things that tend to make government bigger. Why is that? Because they know eventually they'll be in control. Now, what's funny is when you hear of, you know, let's say classism, when you talk about classism, not racism, classism, these are the people that live in those gated communities with the rich people, the wealthy people. Somehow they make very little working for the government, but come out millionaires. Some tend to go in looking a little wealthier than what they claim to be. So you look at classism, they're not going to change that. They want a distance because they're a part of that community. They have to protect themselves and their power. So they tend not to interact with laws and law enforcement and the court system maybe the way you do or I do. You know, oh, that person donates so much to so many things, you know, we have to give them a break. A lot of that's because it's all tax free. A lot of times it's for a safe face too. I have a couple articles that have to do with just some off-topic things that I wanted to cover. And since we were talking about a little bit of foreign and, you know, military spending earlier, Rand Paul, I think President Trump's instincts are still leaning against major involvement in foreign war with great land forces. says, we are at war, quote, we are at war in basically about 7 different countries right now, none of them authorized by Congress. Senator Rand Paul told me yesterday on Sirius XM Insights, Tell Me Everything with John Vogelson. In the wake of Paul's losing attempt Wednesday to repeal the post 9/11 authorizations for use of military force, Senator McCain would have us in 30, 40, 50. He has never met a war he wasn't interested in getting the U.S. involved in. It was one of many colorful foreign policy comments the Tea Party senator made on everything from the Afghanistan mini surge to President Donald Trump's interventionism. I try to give him a little bit of a benefit of a doubt to the fortunes of foreign policy realists in D.C. They're less likely to be completely crazy like the neocons. You can listen to a couple of snippets on SoundCloud and also read an edited partial transcript below. I started out by asking about Wednesday's 61-36 Senate vote to kill Paul's amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act that would have given a 6-month sunset to the authorizations for use of military force that were passed on September 14, 2001, and again in 2002 in the run-up to the Iraq War. Paul, it was an exciting time. We, for the first time in 15 years, had a debate and a full Senate vote on whether or not it is our constitutional duty and responsibility to vote on war. Ever since 9/11 happened, we voted to go after those who attacked us, but that resolution has now been used to justify war in half a dozen countries, maybe a little bit more. In fact, Obama bombed 7 countries without any kind of approval from Congress, and I think that's wrong. It's bad for our country, but it's also a disservice to our soldiers to be at war in so many places, send them to so many misbegotten corners of the globe without really having a full spirited debate about whether or not the public supports the war. The reporter, now you can say it's the first time in 15 years. Is it really the first time in 15 years that this actually was debated on the Senate floor? Paul, I think it was the first time we had a full Senate vote on it. 2 years ago, I got them to discuss an AUMF because they had a water bill in the Foreign Relations Committee. It was a water bill for Africa. They've been working on it for 7 years. And if you want to see a bunch of annoyed, grumpy old senators try to cut off some money they're waiting to give to some other country, and boy, do they get grumpy. All I did was introduce an amendment saying something about whether we should have an AUMF, and all of a sudden everything hits the fan and we come to a screeching halt. But out of it, I forced a debate on the AUMF. And this is an important point for those who are listening, is that you don't get anything around here just by sitting around. You got to force them to do it. They will tell you just nonstop ad nauseum, oh yes, you're right, Senator, but this is neither the time nor the place. You should bring this up in committee. Then when you try to bring it up in committee, they say, now, Senator, you know, this is not the time nor the place to bring this up. Nothing ever gets discussed, and they continually squash debate. But in public, they profess to love debate, and they profess, you're exactly right. we should be discussing whether we should be at war. It's the most important point we debate in Congress, and yet they stifle it and don't want to talk about it. It took 15 years to get a vote on it. Reporter, so you're saying that yesterday when your good friend Senator John McCain was saying that he would welcome to work with you on putting together language having to do with adapted authorization of the use of military force, that you're not participating in overseas betting markets on that happening. Paul, well, here's the deal. He would be happy to work with me on the authorization that actually expands the scope of war around the world. We are at war in basically about 7 different countries right now, none of them authorized by Congress. Senator McCain would have us in 30, 40, or 50. He has never met a war he wasn't interested in getting the U.S. involved in. And so, no, I wouldn't want to work with him on authorization of force because it would be basically less limiting than the one that is sitting around that they dust off from 2001. No, I think what we need is more restriction on war making, not more expansion war making. Reporter, tell us a little bit about how the existing 2 resolutions from September 01 and early 2012 are used when we're bombing Libya on day 83 of the bombing. Is that when the president says, oh, by the way, we do it because of this? How are the justifications actually used? Paul, well, it's worse than you think. They typically point to the one from 2001. And you'll hear people occasionally say, well, it authorizes associated forces. Well, read it. It doesn't say that at all. It says you can go after those who planned, plotted, harbored, or abetted the people who attacked us on 9/11. What they've done is they then extended that to something they call associated forces and descendants of people who might have helped us. If your grandfather helped attack us on 9/11, now you're still in the same tribe. You are of the Taliban movement. We can attack you. But it's worse than that. They go all the way to Libya, to another country, and if someone professes admiration for the Al-Qaeda strand of jihadism, the authorization for 2001 justifies it. But it's worse than that, because every president, Bush, Obama, now Trump, have also said, you know what? We don't really need the 2001 authorization because we also believe that we have the inherent powers of the Constitution, Article 2, they claim allows the president to commit unilateral war anywhere, anytime, without restriction. And they say the only way Congress can stop it is to defund it. But that's patently false. The Founding Fathers said specifically and emphatically that Congress should initiate or declare war. Now you lost, reporter, now you lost yesterday 61 to 36 or 37. What's your reaction to that? Is that actually an optimistic thing because you got to vote and you got at least 36 people voting on your side? What is your assessment rationally, emotionally of what went down yesterday? Paul, you know, if you take that vote to the American public, I think I win 60%. You take it to my home state in Kentucky, I think I win 60%. They had a vote recently that passed out of committee on the House side, and interestingly, several very conservative Republicans, including a former Navy SEAL, voted for it. In fact, I met people all the time in the military, and this is the thing that is really misrepresented or misunderstood by politicians and the media. They think because you join the military that you believe in perpetual war, not debated nor discussed. It's impossible, or probably the opposite. If you're putting your life on the line and you're going to war, you actually want them to have a real debate. If you're on your 8th tour duty in Afghanistan and they're talking about sending you to Yemen, for which there's been no debate, I think the soldiers are rightly actually ticked off about it. I had a conversation with a Navy SEAL who'd been in 19 years. This is about a year and a half ago. And he said, look, we can do anything you ask us. We have the ability, the strength, the equipment to go anywhere in the world and do anything you ask us, but just don't send us abroad and tell us to plant the flag, because we're just not very good about being a mayor of Kabul. We're not good at suppressing the poppy crop. We're not very good at police work. We're soldiers. We're supposed to kill the enemy. I think most soldiers don't like the idea of nation building. You notice even the generals now who still advocate for more war, they always end their sentence by saying, but it's not nation building. I saw National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster not too long ago, and I gave him grief about the Afghan war and said it's a huge mistake. And he said, well, but it's not nation building. I said, how can it be anything but nation building? We're on our 16th year there, and you think you're still fighting the last war? What you are doing is trying to create a nation where no nation has ever existed. Reporter, speaking of Afghanistan and McMaster, give us a sense of your take on the president's reversal of his campaign position about Afghanistan and your overall feeling about his foreign policy interventionism right now, your level of disappointment of where you thought it might be going. Paul, I think President Trump's instincts are still leaning against major involvement in foreign war with great land forces. He campaigned constantly and talked for at least a decade that the Iraq war was a mistake. For 5 or 6 years, he's been saying the Afghan war has lost its purpose and it is a mistake. I think he still believes that. I guess the way I look at it is I try to believe him a little bit, or give him a little bit of benefit of a doubt, in that the surge in Afghanistan, all of his generals, McMaster, James Mattis, all these people, they wanted to put 50,000 troops in, and I think he pushed back, but did not ultimately have the will to say no. But he said, we are only sending 30,000. Now I want to cut in here before we come to the end of the broadcast, and we've seen this strategy again. I would think Paul would catch on to this because they've done this before, where the generals say, "Hey, we need 50,000," or some advisor says, "Hey, we need 50,000," or even the president says, "Hey, we need 50,000," and somehow you're only funded for 7,000, 5,000, 3,000. That's all you can get. Well, then when it doesn't work, where they say, well, we didn't get the right amount of troops, so we need to stay here longer. We need another president that'll give us the troops, or this president needs to give us the troops. Oh, well, then we'll increase it by another, he's going to send 3, so another 3. So now you have 6,000 out of the 50,000. We've seen this happen over and over again. It's the same thing. So hopefully this was just like, well, let me see what you can do with 5,000. If you can do something with 5,000, I might give you more. But I want to see things actually get better. But, I warned before, he started giving generals and people that were not on his side, he started giving them the ability to kind of run, full bore, wide open, no governor. And I think that's going to come back and bite him in the butt. And I think it already kind of starting to, because now you're seeing Trump supporters starting to burn their hats because of this deal with the Democrats, not getting a wall out of it, giving amnesty, even though none of this is, in writing, confirmed, signed, this is not a bill yet. It's saying, oh, we'll work together. So, we do have some of jumping of the gun, but a lot of people say, this isn't looking good. Now, I think if the Democrats keep doing what they're doing and playing like they won, we won, and keep doing it and keep grandstanding, it'll pee off Trump and he'll go back on that. And I think they're fully capable of keeping that whole, throw it in everybody's face. We won. We're Trump's going to do what we want. Yeah, I don't think it'll go far with Trump. He'll kind of be like, yeah, okay, now get down. And then when they don't get down, he's like, never mind, I'm not doing it. Which is twofold. It won't get done, but, another problem with that is they'll use that to make Trump look bad. We have almost an impossible political system anymore that does not seem to obey any type of rules that are there to govern it. And cronyism and, all the corruption is so evident anymore. It's almost, when you see these young youth out here protesting and calling for more government, really, you want more of this. You want more debt. You want more cheap products. You want more, are you going to have to start getting a 30-year loan to buy tires for your car that you have to pay for 80 years? Oh, by the way, your car's not going to probably last you 80 years. Not for the normal person. Where does this stop? Well, it doesn't look good. It doesn't look like we're on a great path, because it seems like we're headed towards, places we've seen in other countries where money, you can be a billionaire, it's not going to buy you. Hopefully I'm wrong, but we'll see what the Fed keeps doing and how the economy actually turns out. Thank you all for tuning in. Stay tuned here on UCY.TV. Great broadcast coming up after this. And don't forget to shop Amazon through UCY.TV. Scroll down towards the bottom. You'll see the Amazon button. Click that button, take you straight to Amazon. You can shop Amazon through UCY. Get the same great prices, and UCY gets a little kickback to help cover operating costs. And also, don't forget antityrannynews.com/MyPatriot takes you to My Patriot Supply. Just like the hurricanes, you need to be prepared, and My Patriot Supply has a lot of what you need to prepare for natural disasters or civil breakdown. So check them out, antityrannynews.com/MyPatriot, and UCY.TV. Scroll down the bottom, click the Amazon button, or you can also donate, click the support button.